seeing something about a man who was a prisoner of war, maybe in North Korea, I forget where now, but he was saying all kinds of things that seemed totally out of character for the individual in question, and it didn't seem at all to indicate what that individual would really have said had he been free to do what he wanted. Now, it turns out that they analyzed the video of that individual and they realized that he was blinking a message in Morse code. That message was, I believe, torture. I think that's what it was. I can't remember for certain, but that certainly is what it seems like it was, thinking back on it now. Now, you may wonder what this has to do with prison communication, or then again, you may not. But let me kind of go through and talk about this on today's Daily Summation from Kurt's Religion and Politics. By the way, I'm your host. Glad to have you aboard today, whether on Rumble, on the podcast, on YouTube. And I am Kurt. I am your host, as I say. Today is Saturday, the 29th of May of 2021, and I'm happy to have you here today, whether it is on Rumble, on the podcast, or on YouTube. Thanks for being here. But I wanted to talk about a subject of prison communication. That may seem like a kind of an odd subject, but it's one that I think needs to be talked about based on something that I heard a pundit say recently. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and read my notes very quickly so that you know where I am. Let's get one thing straight. Prison was never intended to be anything like pleasant. One of the reasons we seek to make sure only guilty people find themselves in jail cells is exactly that. That's why we do that. That's one of the reasons we try to be so careful about that. I don't claim to be some sort of expert about what goes on in prisons. I'm just not. I'd be the last person to try and tell you that. It's also true I don't know how much of the communication between those in confinement and those on the outside, how they compare, how well they compare. If what I've heard is to be believed, though, there are people in jail who are already abusing their connection rights, connection in quotes here, rights, with those not incarcerated to do various kinds of criminal activities or manage them. I'm not sure what one does about that idea, considering, as at least one pundit has said, it can be considered inhumane, to say the least, to not have inmates communicate with family and friends outside of those behind bars, right? You have friends inside, well, you get to communicate with those probably a whole lot more than anybody else. That's the point there. Okay, I'm done with my notes. Well, let's see. I think I had one more thing here. What I do know is if it's possible for people to use their discussions with people not in confinement to continue illicit endeavors, we at least need to solve or deal with that fact. Okay, now I'm done with my notes. So, look, for a very long time, I've held something, and it is, prison makes better criminals, quote, better criminals, right? Makes more able, worse acting people. And it does this in a couple of ways that I've seen. One, sending somebody to prison typically means that they have that on their record, and that means that that particular individual is marred or scarred for a very long time into the future, something I think we need to work on figuring out how to deal with. When a person gets out of jail, we need to figure out how to rehabilitate them, how to help them to actually get back into society. Some would argue that prison is for the purpose of rehabilitation. I argue that it actually serves multiple purposes. One of them is rehabilitation. The other is punishment, frankly. You did wrong, you go to jail. Okay? I'm not saying that I think that it makes sense to take a person who has done wrong and throw them in a jail cell for 40 years. And I think if you do that, you risk that individual coming out, or worse yet, if it's 5 or 6, believe it or not, because a person who's been in for 40 years will find a way to stay out if they really want to do so. If they don't, they'll find a way back in and they'll stay there, most likely, many of them. But if they want out by that point in their lives, they'll get out and they'll find a way to make a life for themselves, and they'll work their way slowly into positions where they are actually in better and better positions. People who have 5 years, 2 years, 10 years, those people are dealing with the reputation of having been in jail. It's that simple. It's just that simple. And that's a hard thing. So I think that there's something to be said for the idea of trying to make it so that people who are in jail have the opportunity when they get out to work on showing that they are rehabilitated. And I think that we need to realize that people learn from their pasts, and that's an important thing. That said, I really honestly believe there are a lot of people who are in jail who either get illicit cell phones or do some other thing that makes it so that they can communicate with people on the outside and continue criminal activities while they're in. And this is particularly true for people like crime bosses, right? I don't know how much that happens. You see it on the movies and all that. How many times does a person who's a, quote, crime boss end up talking with people of quote, the family or whatever you want to call them, with whom they're have done their criminal activities, and continuing those criminal endeavors while they're still in jail? How many people does that happen for? So that, I think, is one question that we have to answer, right? Even if they're talking to family, they might be talking to somebody who they can pass something on to, who will then pass on things for them. This is something that happens, right? And I'm not trying to say I know that it happens a lot. In fact, I think I would ask the question, and anybody of you out there who can answer for me, I'd love to hear you answer. What do you think about that? Do you think that it's not an unusual thing for people who are inside prison cells, jail house walls, to communicate with people, to continue to do things that they really shouldn't be doing, right? That are illegal and so forth, that are maybe even the very things that got them into the jail in the first place, in confinement, right? How often does this happen? I'm told that there's a lot of illicit activity in prisons. I'm told that there are people who can get hold of communications devices of various kinds. I'm told that there are people who, when they communicate with other people, often on the outside, the people that they communicate with are people who can do things for them, or who are involved in criminal activities that they help to support in some fashion by their knowledge or whatever. This is the sort of thing I'm told. Is it true? I don't know. I'm not a guy who knows a lot about this sort of stuff, but I'd really like to have people comment and tell me about either their experiences or others that they know, preferably their experiences. Not necessarily themselves having been in jail, but if you've been in a jail correctional custody person, person who watched over people in jail and so forth, that you would be somebody that I would definitely want to know what you would have to say about that. If you've been in jail, I'd like to know your take on it. I'd like to know what you think should be done to make it possible for people inside to communicate with their family and friends so that they don't go nuts while they're inside, which it's a possibility. I see it as a possibility. I'd like to know what you think about that. My personal take on things is, as long as there's a risk that people are going to use their communications with the outside world to do heinous, bad, and wrong things, you have to worry about that as part of what you deal with. Does that mean you don't let them communicate with people on the outside? I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is, if a person is clever enough, they can figure out a way to get their message out there if they're allowed communication with the outside world. That doesn't mean you don't allow them that communication, but it does mean you watch for people and maybe take punitive action for people who do that. I'm not sure. I get solitary confinement in the sense of a person acts badly and you put them in solitary so that they will straighten out. I get solitary confinement in the case of protection of individuals, but I will say that in general, it seems to me like one or two things ought to happen for a person in solitary confinement who's there for their protection. Either they ought to be put in a place where people are not likely to shiv them or whatever, or they ought to be put in another part of the population. All right, I've basically run out of time. I'm kind of surprised that I've talked as long on this as I have, but I have. Again, I'd really like to know other people's opinions on this. In my opinion, you have to be really careful what you allow in terms of communications for people in the penal system to people outside of it because of the various things that they can do that are problematic. This has been the Daily Summation from Kurt's Religion and Politics. I am your host, and today is Saturday, the 29th of May of 2021. Tomorrow then will be Sunday, the 30th of May of 2021. Thank you for everyone who's been here on Rumble, on the podcast, and on YouTube. Today we talked about prison communication, and tomorrow I want to get back onto a subject that I've talked about a time or two before, and I want to kind of discuss it maybe from a slightly different angle than I have before. I'll have to look at my notes to see exactly what that was about, but the subject is taxing the rich. Hope you're having a good day today. Hope everything is going well for you. If you're a Sabbath keeper, I hope you're having a good Sabbath today. And hopefully we will see you again on tomorrow's Daily Summation. The speaker on this edition of the Daily Summation is Kurt Schubert. This video was recorded on Saturday, the 29th of May of 2021. The Daily Summation is created for Kurt's Religion and Politics. Thanks for watching this edition of the Daily Summation from Kurt's Religion and Politics. I hope you found it entertaining or instructional, or maybe both. If you want to see more from me, you can go to blogs.kpschubert.com. That's blogs.kpschubert.com. I am on Twitter, Parler, and Minds.com. My handle on each of those is @kpschubert. That's @kpschubert. I have a Rumble and a YouTube channel. They are the Kurt's Religion and Politics channels on Rumble and YouTube. I have a Facebook page. The Facebook page is Kurt's Religion and Politics as well. I am on Patreon. If you want to support me, that's one of the better places you can do that. And you will find me at Kurt's Religion and Politics on Patreon. I have a podcast. The podcast is podcasts with an S, .kpschubert.com. That's podcasts.kpschubert.com. I think you should be able to find me with relative ease on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify as well. The best way I find to do that is to look for Kurt's Religion and Politics. You can try to use the Daily Summation. I find that it doesn't work as well as a general rule, but you can always try that. I'm glad to have you aboard today, and hopefully we will see you again tomorrow.